When we left chapter 4, Ram was at the outside of the camp. So this is chapter 5 of Boy of the Painted Cave. Throughout the little camp, the hunters heard the whimpering sound too. "A wolf! A wolf!" shouted one. They reached for their spears, grabbed flaming torches from the fire, and rushed out into the darkness to search the bushes and scrubwood. Volt heard the noise. Throwing his deerskin robe across his shoulders, he strode into the firelight. "What is it?" "Wolf," a hunter repeated. "Kill the evil beast," shouted Volt, "or it will be a curse on our camp." He followed the hunters, shaking his spear. Tao stood at the edge of the camp listening to the men moving through the forest. He heard them beating the bushes with their spears, and he saw their torches bobbing in the darkness. He tried to think of some way to save the little wolf. To raise his voice or call out would only bring the hunters running. Somehow, he had to find Ram before they did. He grabbed a flaming stick from the fire and limped out into the night. He heard the hunters crashing through the underbrush, and he knew they were forming a wide circle, getting ready to close in and surround the wolf dog. Tao held his torch high, trying to see through the dark branches of the buckthorn trees. "Ram," he whispered, his eyes searching the dim light. "Where are you, Ram?" Moments passed. The little animal had been frightened off by the noise, but Tao was sure he must be near. He called again softly, "Ram." Nothing moved. His torch flickered, and the waving shadows of the buckthorn trees played tricks on his eyes. His heart sank as he heard the hunters come closer. The ring of spears was tightening. Just then a gray shadow moved across his path, slinking out of the darkness. Tao waited as the animal crept toward him, whimpering. It was Ram. Tao leaned down and pushed him back. "Go," he whispered. "Get away quickly." Ram refused to move. He stood there looking up at Tao, a fearful look in his yellow eyes. Tao picked up a stick as if to throw it. "Go," he ordered sharply. But it was too late. Tao heard the voices of the hunters only a few paces away. The little wolf was nearly surrounded. Quickly, Tao sprang forward. He thrust his torch into the damp earth, quenching the flame, then threw it aside. He curled the leg of his bad foot around the shaft of his spear and vaulted ahead. "Wolf! Wolf!" he shouted, long enough for the hunters to hear. "Come," he whispered fiercely to the wolf dog. Stumbling, lurching through the forest, Tao heard their pounding feet as the hunters picked up the trail. Without looking back, Tao hurtled over the ground, dodging between the trees and bushes. The wolf dog followed close behind as Tao ran into the night. Branches whipped across his face, tree roots caught at his feet, holding him back. But if he could run fast enough, long enough, he knew he would outrun the hunters and save Ram. Breathing hard, he pushed his way through the underbrush, listening to the grunts and shouts of the angry men as they came after him. He ran faster and faster, twisting and turning through the trees and brush, trying to throw them off track. But they kept up the pace, crashing through the forest not far behind him. He stumbled on blindly through the blackness, vaulting along on the shaft of his spear. His arms grew heavy. His legs were like stones. The trees, the shadows, the night itself became a tangled wall, holding him back as he plunged into darkness. How long he ran, Tao did not know. But little by little, the shouts and footsteps began to fade. He continued on until he was sure it was safe. Panting and out of breath, he had almost reached the river. He stopped and looked around. The wolf dog was not behind him. "Ram," he whispered, searching the darkness. "Where are you?" He waited, listening. Nothing moved. He wondered if Ram had been caught. Maybe the wolf dog had been killed and the hunters had turned back, but he had heard nothing. Silence and darkness added to his gloom. His head throbbed and he turned to go back. Then once again he saw a ram slink out of the shadows, whimpering, creeping up to him on his belly. With a wave of relief, Tao stooped down and threw his arms around the animal's shoulders. He spoke to him firmly. "You cannot come into the camp of the clan people," he said. "They have no love for the wolves. They will kill you." Tao pushed the little animal away. "Go," he said sharply. "Go back and wait in the slough." Ram looked up, panting, his tongue lolling out of the side of his mouth. Tao reached down to pick up a stone. Immediately, the wolf dog turned. He looked back once or twice, then disappeared into the darkness. Tao grinned. At last he had found a way to make the wolf dog understand. Tao walked lightly as he returned to camp, but he put on an angry face. "I could not catch him," he said to the hunters who had gathered by the fire. "But he is far gone. He will not return." Volt grunted, slamming his fist into the palm of his hand. "It is an evil sign," he said, rubbing his scarred cheek with the back of his hand, his dark, shaggy head nodding. "It is an evil sign." "We must watch for him and kill him," said Garth. Sometimes Garth sounded more like Volt than Volt himself. "We will not let him get away again." Tao felt his stomach turn. The next morning, after he had banked the fires with 3 younger boys of the clan, Tao walked out along the foot of the limestone cliffs, far away from camp. The ash-gray walls loomed high over his head, and he came to a spot with many caves. "This is a good place," he thought. "Here I can make images away from the eyes of Volt and the hunters. Yet it is close enough to visit Kala and bring back food to her and the clan people." He looked up at the steepy, rocky ledges and started to climb. It was not easy, but he was able to cling to the crevices and stunted pine shrubs growing out of the cliff wall. The first 2 caves he saw were not to his liking. One was too small, and the walls were rough and uneven. The second had an animal smell. Tao did not wish to share his home with a leopard or a bear. About halfway up, he found a third one. It looked out over the flat valley. He saw no pug marks, and he was sure it was deserted. It was about 10 spear lengths long and opened into a small cavern. The walls were smooth with only a few breaks or cracks. "This is what I am looking for," he thought. "This will be a good place to stay." Certain that he had found what he wanted, Tao spent 4 days filling his cave with dried grass, firewood, and kindling. Kala gave him a bearskin robe and a tallow lamp made from a large cockleshell filled with an animal fat and a wick made of peat moss. She showed him how to dry cattail roots and burreed tubers for cooking. She wrapped live embers in a handful of wet grass, placed them in a hollow bone, and gave them to him for his fire. When his cave was ready, Tao went down to the little stream that ran through the willow wood and found a bank of yellow clay. He scooped out some of the clammy substance, rolled it into long pieces, and let them dry in the sun. He picked oak twigs and burned them in the fire to make sticks of charcoal. This done, he stepped back and looked around his little cave. With his chunks of clay and charcoal and a handful of moss for a wiper, he was ready to become a maker of images. He had no picture or sketch to work from. He would have to draw from memory. He picked up a stick of dried clay. It felt good in his hand, and he made a mark on the gray wall. It showed up bold and sharp. "I will draw a horse," he thought. "Even though no one else will see it, I will know what I have done, and I will feel good." He started with the head, drawing the long face and the square jaw. Next, he sketched in the ears and the gentle curve of the neck. He worked quickly, trying to see in his mind's eye how the horses looked when he saw them out in the valley. With firm strokes of the chalk, he drew in the muscular body, the shoulder, the arched rump, and the tail. Then he tried to draw the legs. His hand hesitated. Did the front leg bend just below the body or farther down? He could not remember. The hind legs were even more difficult. He thought they slanted toward the tail, then bent forward at the knee. His hand moving across the wall. When he was finished, he stepped back. It's not right, he thought. The legs are all wrong. Impatiently, he rubbed it out with a handful of moss and started again. This time, he drew the body first, adding the legs and the long sweeping tail. But when he drew the head, it was too big for the body. He shook his head peevishly. It's no good, he said. It's more like a bear. He tried again and again, but each time it only seemed to get worse. He tried drawing a row of heads, then a row of bodies, but they didn't match. He shook his head in frustration and threw the chalk against the wall, where it broke in 100 pieces. I'll never learn, he said. He sat on the cold floor, brooding for a while. Then he picked up another piece of chalk and tried again. All day long he drew horses, small horses, running horses, all kinds of horses. He forgot to eat the ground plums Kala had given him. He forgot to make his drink of birch tea. The harder he tried, the more trouble he had. He dropped his chalk and lay down on his bearskin rug, tired, angry, and discouraged, and he fell asleep. When he awoke the next morning, it was quiet. He looked around. There was no smell of Kala's fire, no sound of voices. Then he remembered he was alone, and he was hungry. He climbed down the cliff and made his way across the valley. When he reached the river, he turned west and continued on until he came to the slough. The trees and vines were green with new leaves. The black loam was thick with uncoiling ferns, and the dank bottomland smelled sweet and earthy. He stopped for a moment and looked around to be sure no one had seen him. Then he pushed on through the thickets and into the slough. He had long forgotten about evil spirits and demons, and he stopped at the stream to feast on watercress and mussels. No longer hungry, he went down into the glades where he hoped to catch a rabbit or even a young pig. He was searching around the clumps of dwarf oaks when he saw Ram come running through the tall grass. Tao smiled broadly. He was surprised to see how well the little wolf dog looked. Ram had gained weight, and his silver gray fur coat was clean and smooth. The animal crept up to him, whimpering, holding its head low. As Tao reached down to pet it, it rolled over on his back and licked his hand. You are growing, said Tao. Someday you will be a fine wolf dog. You must learn to stay away from the clan people and the hunters. Come, he said. Now we will hunt together. All that morning they hunted through the slough, catching rabbits, field mice, and a willow grouse. With Ram trotting by his side, Tao started back for his little cave. He looked around again as he crossed the open valley to be sure no one was watching. Once in the shelter of the cave, they were safe. Here, Tao started his fire from the old embers and roasted their grouse and rabbits. The sun had not yet set behind the hills, and golden shafts of light streamed in through the cave entrance. Ram was standing in the opening, and as Tao ate, he saw the wolf's dog body outlined against the pink skyline. Quickly, he pushed aside his food and picked up a piece of chalk. He began sketching, hurriedly, trying to catch the animal's form and shape. He worked swiftly, his hand gliding over the cave wall. He drew in the sharp muzzle, the pointed ears, erect and alert. His hand flew in curves and swoops, catching the leaf beauty of the silver gray body. He stepped back and looked at the picture. Then he picked up a stick of charcoal and added the slitted eyes and the coal black nose. This time he was pleased, and he did not rub out the drawing. He knew now that if he had something to go by, something to guide his eyes, he could make an image true and without mistakes. Chapter 5, Boy of the Painted Cave.